I'm going to show you how to make fancy cloth napkins. These napkins have mitered corners and they're hemmed at about 1.5 inches, which I think gives a nice heavy weight to the edge of the napkin and just makes it a really beautiful napkin for your table. I really like using an Essex, which is a cotton linen blend, or a cotton linen canvas, or even a 100% linen is really beautiful for these napkins. The other tools you might need are scissors, a marking tool, a rotary cutter, cutting mat and ruler, pins, a sewing needle and thread. You can get away with just using scissors and needle and thread, and an iron and pins. You don't have to have a sewing machine or a rotary cutter for this project. To make these napkins, you'll need at least 2/3 of a yard of fabric, and that will give you 2 napkins. Or from 2 yards, you can get 6 napkins, which is exciting. First, I'll show you how to cut your fabric. You're going to cut 2 squares. Here I have 2/3 of a yard, so I'm gonna get 2 napkins out of this. You cut your squares at 22 inches, which means you'll just barely get 2 napkins out of the width selvage to selvage. I'm gonna start by cutting it in half. You can use scissors for this, and actually for this tutorial, it's a really great project if you don't have a lot of sewing equipment. You can really just make these napkins with scissors and a sewing needle and thread. So I'm gonna show you how to do it both ways, how to cut it out both ways, and how to sew it both ways. First, you start by cutting your fabric in half. I'm gonna use my rotary cutter. If you have scissors, you'll just cut along the fold here if it's a folded 44-inch wide fabric. I'm gonna use my rotary cutter though to just cut this fold off and make a really straight edge. And I'm gonna leave my 2 layers of fabric together so that I can cut out both at once. If you just have scissors, you can mark your 22-inch square on here with a ruler and then cut it out with your scissors. So with my rotary cutter, I'm going to line it up on my mat and trim it square at 22 inches. Oops. And you might notice that this is a little bit shy of 22 inches. A lot of this is gonna get folded under. I'm gonna go at 21.5. So if your fabric isn't quite 44 inches wide, you can just trim off the selvage. And so I'm gonna start with a 21.5 inch square. So it's not a big deal if it's not exactly 22, but since my other side is shorter, I'm gonna cut this final 4th side to 21.5, so I will have a square. And since I have 2 layers here, now I have 2 napkins that I can finish. And I will show you how to get ready to miter the corners. First, we're going to press around all 4 sides, turning it, the edge of this under at 1/4 inch. And I'm just eyeballing it. You can also use a seam gauge to make it really accurate. And these corners are going to get trimmed off, so don't worry too much about what happens here. After you press all 4 sides of your fabric down at 1/4 inch, you're going to mark for the mitered corners. So you'll need your ruler, and it's really helpful to have one that has a 45-degree line on it and some sort of marking tool. I love these. They're friction pens, which you can mark and then erase, which is really nice, and they're very accurate. So starting at one corner, you're going to mark in at 1.5 inches from the edge. You're basically finding a point that's 1.5 inches from both edges of the corner. So there and there. So there's my point. And then I'm going to mark a 45-degree line that intersects that point. So I'm lining up my ruler at 45 here, and then I'm moving it along that edge until the corner of the ruler hits that point. And then going from the very edge of this folded over edge of my fabric, I'm going to mark across that and make sure to make a good mark right at the corner or at the edge there. And you're going to want to do this mark at all 4 corners of your fabric. If you want to sew these miters by hand, you will fold it over and match that edge in just the same way. And then you're just going to sew this by hand. I would start by securing the thread just by making a few, where's the end of my thread here? Making a few stitches in place at one end of your seam. And then you'll do a running stitch down this line and secure the thread at the other end. And now that I'm at that fold, I'm just going to stitch a few times in place. To make a knot. And I can pull that last stitch through a loop and just trim my thread. And repeat that for the rest of your 4 corners. My machine's set on just a regular stitch length, and I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and the end of this little seam. And repeat that for all 4 corners of your napkin. After all your miters are sewn, you're going to use scissors and trim the corner off at about 1/4 inch. And then you're going to trim the tip of this at a 45-degree angle. Don't snip your thread there, but just trim off that corner pretty close to the point. Once those are trimmed, you're going to turn your corners right side out. You may want a point turner or a chopstick to help you get those points nice and pointy. And then after you turn all of your points, the hem should sort of just lay itself flat. So I'll do this other one, and then we can kind of see how it's just going to lay flat there. And once you've turned all those points out, you'll press this down with your iron. I like to use flatter because it makes things smell delicious and makes your pressing really nice and crisp. I don't feel like I poked this point out very well. You want to be kind of gentle when you're poking those points out, but yeah, you don't want to poke through it. Once you've pressed this flat, you're ready to sew the last step is to sew this hem down. You can sew it by machine or you can sew it by hand. And sewing by hand gives this a really nice finish where you can't really see much of the stitching on the right side. So if you have the time or if you don't have a machine, it's a really lovely way to finish these napkins. I'm going to show you first how to sew it on machine, and then I'll show you some hand stitching if you want to do it that way. When you're sewing this on the machine, you want to have a regular stitch. I like to start in the middle of one of my sides instead of at the corner. Instead of back stitching, I'm just going to go all the way around the napkin and then overlap the beginning of my seam by a few stitches to secure it in place. So without back stitching, just go ahead and sew around the four sides. You're sewing right along this inner edge here. And when you get to the corner here, you might want to hand wheel and get your needle just right onto that seam. Then you can lift your presser foot up, pivot, and go down the next side after you put your presser foot back down. And now I'm coming right up to the beginning again, and I'll go about a ½ inch past where my beginning of my seam is. And then I don't need to back stitch because I've overlapped my stitches, and you want to try and line them right up on top of each other, and that's going to make that the least visible finish for that seam. And then when I'm done, I'll trim those threads. And I have a finished napkin. If you'd like to hand sew the hem of your napkin, I like to use pins here. I didn't use them when I was machine sewing, but as you're hand sewing your napkin, using pins helps you keep everything in place as you're, moving it around in your hands. So I went ahead and pinned around the sides that I had already pressed. And then I'm going to use a hand sewing needle and my thread. And similar to the way that I locked my first stitch in by stitching a couple times in place, I'm going to lock my thread in, and I'm just sewing into the hem layer. I'm not sewing through the front of the napkin right now. So I'm just securing my thread into the back side of this hem by stitching a few times in place. And I'm starting at one of my corners. You can really start anywhere. And then once you have it secure, you're going to just pick up a tiny bit of the front of the napkin. So I'm skipping past the hem and picking up just a few threads from the front. And then going only into the hem, I'll go about a ½ inch through that hem, going into the hem, and then a ½ inch down, I'll come out. And then where I came out of the hem, I'll just go directly below that into the front of the napkin and pick up a few threads. And I'm going to go back and forth between the front of the napkin and the fold of the hem. So I'm going to do about a ½ inch in the fold, in the hem, and then just a few threads where I came out on the front of the napkin. And this is a really nice meditative lap craft to do. When you hand sew the napkin, it gives a really nice finish, and you can't even really see the stitches, especially if you use a thread that really matches your fabric. So it's a really beautiful, classy way to finish these napkins.